On his birthday, a father stood in the doorway of the very house he built with his own hands, only to be told by his son that he was no longer welcome. The same son, who had just pocketed $30 million from the lottery, looked him straight in the eyes and threw him out as if he were nothing. The air froze, the silence cut sharper than any blade, and betrayal burned deeper than any wound. What kind of child does this to a parent who sacrificed everything? Subscribe now and share where you're watching from, because what happens next will leave you speechless. He stood frozen in the entryway, the words still echoing as if the walls themselves refused to let them go. His son's voice, once the sound that used to fill him with pride, now cut like a jagged shard of glass. The father couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He had heard his boy say many things over the years, but never anything so cruel, never something that stripped away decades of sacrifice with such cold precision. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from age, not from frailty, but from a shock so deep it rooted him to the floorboards he had once sanded with his own hands. His house felt unrecognizable. Every corner carried a memory, the scrape of a toy truck gouging the baseboard when his son was 5, the faint shadow on the wall from the Christmas lights they'd strung together one winter, the smell of varnish from when he refinished the kitchen table to give them all a place to gather. Now all of it felt stripped of warmth, as though the life they had lived here had been erased with a single command. The familiar walls seemed to push him out, as if they too had been convinced by the lottery millions that he no longer belonged. His son's eyes didn't flinch. There was no hesitation, no guilt, only the smug composure of a man who believed money could rewrite history. The father's gaze traveled across the living room where his son's wife leaned back in comfort, her painted nails tapping against a glass of champagne. Her smirk told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was rehearsed, planned, savored. The betrayal wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was an eviction signed in greed. The father's hands trembled as he gripped the handle of his worn leather bag, the same one he had carried to work sites for years, filled with tools that built homes for strangers, while he poured his heart into this one. He had brought it inside tonight, thinking he'd set it down beside the couch, maybe share a meal, maybe even hear his son say the words, "Thank you for all the years of support." Instead, the bag felt like an anchor dragging him into disbelief, proof that he was already nothing more than a guest in the place where he should have been king. His chest tightened as memories crashed against the present. He saw his son at 12 beaming with pride as he showed him a science project on the same dining table where strangers now laughed. He heard the echoes of birthday candles blown out in the kitchen, the cheers of Little League games. He never missed the quiet nights of homework when his son leaned on his shoulder for answers. All of it layered over the sight of his son, now a grown man with hardened eyes, dismissing him as if those moments had never mattered. The betrayal stung sharper because it wasn't delivered by an enemy. It came from blood, from the boy he once carried on his shoulders, the boy whose scraped knees he had bandaged, the boy who had whispered, "I love you, Dad," under the covers after a nightmare. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who wore arrogance like armor, a man who thought $30 million was enough to erase the father who had given him everything. The father's throat burned as he tried to speak, but words refused to form. What could he say? That he had worked double shifts in the dead of winter to keep the mortgage paid, that every splinter in his hands was proof of the life he had built for this ungrateful son. He wanted to remind him of the nights he had gone without, so his child could have more. The bills he had shouldered, the promises he had kept. But none of it mattered now. The silence between them roared louder than any plea he could muster. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. The laughter of his son's in-laws rang from the living room like a cruel soundtrack, every note reminding him that his place had been stolen not just by his son's greed, but by outsiders who now lounged where he once sat. Their voices overlapped with the clinking of glasses, shallow toasts, to a future built on money, not loyalty. He realized with a sick twist of his stomach that they had been waiting for this moment, that the celebration wasn't about the lottery win at all. It was about his removal, the final act in a play where he had unknowingly been cast as the villain in his own home. He took a step back, his legs shaky, his chest aching as though the floor beneath him had tilted. The house looked the same, yet every object seemed to glare at him with accusation. The framed photos on the mantel pictures of a smiling family he had once believed unbreakable now mocked him. His face was there, frozen in time, but already fading, already irrelevant. He felt like a ghost haunting his own past. The father's jaw clenched as he stared at his son, desperately searching for a flicker of doubt, a trace of hesitation. But the young man's eyes remained cold, unyielding, filled with the confidence of someone who believed he had outgrown the man who raised him. That confidence, that unshakable arrogance, cut deeper than the words themselves. It told the father this was no mistake, no heated argument. It was a declaration. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless in front of the boy he had once believed would carry his legacy forward. His pulse throbbed in his temples, his vision blurred, but not from age or weakness. It was the raw pain of betrayal, the kind that hollows a man from the inside out. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but instead he stood in silence, his pride refusing to beg for a place in a life he had built from the ground up. He realized then that this moment was not just about losing a home. It was about losing his son. The man standing before him was no longer the child he had loved unconditionally. He was a stranger wearing his son's face, a stranger who saw him as disposable. And that realization split something deep inside him, something that could never be repaired. The father's breath came heavy, each inhale burning his lungs. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room one last time. Every memory pressed against him, suffocating, until all that remained was the sharp truth: he didn't belong here anymore. His son had made sure of that. The walls he had painted, the floors he had laid, the roof he had repaired through storm after storm, all of it now belonged to someone else. Not in name, but in spirit. And yet, as the father stepped back into the cold night air, clutching his bag, a spark ignited in the hollow left by his son's betrayal. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of something sharper than pain, steadier than grief. He did not yet know what shape it would take, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this story was not finished. Because what his son had taken with money, the father would reclaim with something far more powerful. And the world was about to learn that betrayal once planted grows roots that twist in unexpected ways. The father's eyes fixed on his son, and for a brief second he almost didn't recognize the man standing there. The boy he had once lifted onto his shoulders now stood arm in arm with his wife, both of them cloaked in a smugness so sharp it could slice through steel. His son's lips curled into a smile that wasn't joy, wasn't kindness, but the cruel grin of a man who believed he had conquered his own blood. It was a look that carried triumph, as though evicting his father from the very home he had built was some twisted prize to flaunt. The father felt the air press against his chest, heavy and suffocating, as if the house itself was mocking him for being so blind to what his son had become. Beside the son, the daughter-in-law's gaze glimmered with quiet satisfaction. Her chin lifted slightly, her posture rigid, polished, rehearsed. She didn't need to speak. Her expression said enough. To her, the old man wasn't family, wasn't someone to honor or respect. He was an inconvenience finally being removed, a burden erased with a single wave of her husband's hand. That subtle smirk burned more than a shouted insult. It was a reminder that he no longer belonged, that the life he had poured into this family was dismissed as worthless. The father shifted his weight, gripping the strap of his weathered bag tighter. His knuckles whitened, not out of rage, but out of the sheer will it took to hold himself upright. Humiliation seared through him like fire, his face flushing with a heat that came not from anger alone, but from a bone-deep sense of degradation. He was being paraded as an example, a defeated king stripped of his crown, forced to stand and watch as his throne was given away. The room around him blurred for a moment. He saw movement but not detail, heard laughter but not words. Every chuckle from the in-laws felt like a nail driven into his dignity. They weren't loud, but the sound filled his ears like a drumbeat. He caught a glimpse of champagne glasses raised in celebration, their crystal edges glinting in the light like blades. It wasn't just a drink, it was a toast to his exile. The father swallowed hard, his throat dry, the weight of silence crushing him. He wanted to demand why, to spit questions that clawed at his insides. But deep down he knew the answer. He wasn't being pushed aside for a reason. He was being pushed aside because he could be, because they thought they had the power now, because they had convinced themselves that money erased memory, that wealth rewrote loyalty. His son's lottery win had turned into a throne, and the first act of his reign was to humiliate the very man who built him. He looked at his son again, searching desperately for something human, some flicker of hesitation or guilt. Instead, he saw a man puffed up by victory, chest-high, jaw firm, radiating the smug energy of someone who believed he had just won a war. The father's stomach twisted. He realized he wasn't even being treated like family anymore. He was being treated like a conquered enemy. The walls of the house seemed to close in, pressing him toward the door. The pictures on the wall, family photos frozen in happier years, appeared to mock him. In one frame, his son at age 10, grinning with missing teeth, holding a baseball glove. In another, the family gathered around a Christmas tree, laughter in their eyes. Those moments were now cheap decorations in a home where he was unwelcome. They felt like lies, artifacts of a story that had been rewritten without him. The daughter-in-law's parents sat comfortably on the couch, legs crossed, sipping their drinks like royalty in borrowed territory. They didn't look at him with pity or even contempt. They looked through him as though he didn't exist at all. That was the sharpest cut of all. To be hated was one thing. To be invisible was far worse. The father straightened his shoulders, but the weight of shame made it feel like lifting stones. His chest heaved with slow, controlled breaths. He would not cry here, not in front of them, not in front of the son who once begged him for bedtime stories. The humiliation was sharp enough to draw tears, but he refused to give them that satisfaction. He chose silence, though inside the storm roared. As he stood there, he realized this was not only betrayal. This was spectacle. His son wanted him to feel small, wanted him to understand that he was no longer needed, no longer respected. The cruel grin wasn't for the father, it was for the audience in the room. It was a performance of power, a demonstration meant to cement his exile with witnesses. The father's heart pounded with a mix of despair and defiance. He had never known such piercing bitterness, never felt so deeply dishonored. The boy he raised had grown into a man who measured worth not in love or loyalty, but in dollars and dominance. And yet beneath the crushing shame there was something else, something faint but steady, a resolve beginning to form, hardening like steel beneath the surface. He stepped back, his shoes sinking slightly into the rug he had once chosen with care, now stained with spilled wine, from a celebration that wasn't his. He turned his head one last time toward his son, the image of arrogance burned into his memory. That smirk, that air of triumph would stay with him. It would remind him of this night, of this moment, when dignity was stripped away and pride was ground into dust. But what his son couldn't see was that humiliation has a way of sharpening men, of forging them into something stronger than before. As the father gripped his bag and felt the chill of the night air seeping through the doorway, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the wound that would give birth to something else entirely. Because deep in his chest, past the shame, past the grief, past the bitterness, a thought began to spark, one that would carry him forward. His son thought this was victory. He thought the game was over, but he had no idea what kind of man he had just humiliated. And soon he would learn. The father stood there, his body stiff as stone, but his mind betrayed him, flooding with memories he had no power to stop. They came without mercy, raw and vivid, each one a reminder of the years he had given away piece by piece, until there was nothing left but calloused hands and a weary heart. He remembered the first pair of shoes he bought for his son's shoes that were one size too big because he wanted them to last through the growth spurts. He could see himself working overtime on a frozen construction site, his fingers bleeding from cracked skin, just to make sure that little boy would never feel the shame of going without. The images stacked one over another like frames in an old reel of film. He saw himself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, bills spread across the surface, his wife asleep in the next room, his son curled in bed without a care. He would trace the numbers with tired eyes, wondering how he would stretch a paycheck far enough to cover shoes braces and the never-ending cost of a boy's dreams. Somehow he always found a way. He always sacrificed himself before he let his son feel the weight of hunger or fear. He thought of the old truck he had driven into the ground, repairing it over and over so he could save for his son's first car. He thought of the baseball games where he shouted until his throat was raw, working weekends so he could afford the cleats, the glove, the uniform. He remembered the pride on his son's face when he walked onto that field, a pride that once seemed to say thank you without words. That pride was gone now, erased by greed, replaced with a smirk that stung more than a fist. His chest tightened as another memory surfaced, one he had buried deep. The day his son was accepted into college. He had held that letter in trembling hands, reading the words again and again, barely believing it. He hadn't cared how many hours of back-breaking labor it would take, how many nights he would sleep in his work boots just to scrape together tuition. He had promised himself that his boy would have opportunities he never had. That boy was supposed to use his education to build a life on honor, not on betrayal. The father could still feel the sting of those sacrifices, the blisters on his palms from gripping tools too long, the ache in his spine from lifting loads that should have been shared, the relentless exhaustion of a man who put his child before everything. And now, standing in the home he had once protected, he felt those sacrifices mocked, every scar on his body turned into evidence of a fool's devotion. He bit the inside of his cheek, fighting the surge of emotion. His eyes stung, but he refused to let the tears fall. Tears would not bring back the years. Tears would not erase the image of his son, now a man standing proud in victory over him. He asked himself the question no father should ever have to ask. How did love turn into this coldness? Where had the bond been severed? Was it money? Was it influence? Or had the betrayal been growing silently all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? His pulse quickened as more memories rose like ghosts. He saw Christmas mornings when his son tore open presents he could barely afford, never knowing his father had skipped meals to make it happen. He saw graduation night, the pride in his chest so heavy it nearly choked him as he watched his son cross the stage. That same son now looked at him not with gratitude, but with disdain, as if all of those years had been owed, as if love had been nothing more than a transaction that expired the moment wealth entered the picture. The father's throat closed as he remembered the nights he had stayed up waiting for his son to come home, praying he was safe, praying he was making good choices. He thought of the times he had defended him, stood by him, even when others doubted. And here he was stripped of dignity, treated like a stranger in his own home. The bitterness of it was enough to poison the air in his lungs. Every memory carried with it a sharp edge of regret. He regretted the times he had said yes when no would have taught his son more. He regretted covering debts, paying for mistakes, shielding him from the consequences that might have made him stronger, more grateful. Instead, he had created a man who saw kindness as weakness, who mistook sacrifice for servitude. And now that same man smiled at his downfall as if it were a sport. The father's heart pounded with the weight of it, all the years of giving, the years of silence, the years of believing that family was unbreakable. His body felt hollow, drained, but somewhere in the hollowness something stirred. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was the realization that every sacrifice he had made was now fuel. Every memory was no longer a wound, but a spark, each one feeding into a fire that burned hotter beneath the humiliation. He straightened slowly, his shoulders rising against the crushing shame. His son's smug smile and his daughter-in-law's gleaming satisfaction might have painted him as defeated, but the father knew better. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. The memories that broke him were also the ones that hardened him. And in that moment he understood something his son could never buy with lottery millions resilience. The father inhaled steady and controlled his eyes, scanning the house one more time. The walls no longer mocked him. They reminded him. They whispered that nothing built by sacrifice could be erased so easily, not even by betrayal this sharp. He closed his hand tighter around the strap of his bag and turned toward the door. The night outside waited dark and cold, But it wasn't as lonely as the room he was leaving behind. Because in that darkness he carried something his son couldn't see, something no one in that house could comprehend. The memories that had humiliated him were about to become the blueprint for something else entirely. And as he stepped into the night air, he knew the past wasn't finished speaking. It was only beginning to sharpen its voice. What came next would not be silence. It would be something far more unforgettable. The father's chest burned as if his very ribs were filled with fire, but not a word escaped his lips. His tongue pressed hard against the back of his teeth, his jaw locked tight, every muscle in his face holding back the flood that threatened to pour out. Silence was his last weapon, his only shield against the humiliation that hung in the air like smoke. He knew if he spoke, his voice would betray him. If he let his throat open, the pain would crack through in sobs he refused to offer these people. So he swallowed it whole, letting it tear down his insides instead. The son's smirk widened, mistaking silence for surrender. He leaned back, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder, fingers tapping idly as though he'd just won a game of cards, as though this was nothing more than a moment of strategy. The daughter-in-law crossed her legs, her heel bouncing with a lazy rhythm, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of victory. Their arrogance pressed down on him, daring him to break, daring him to beg for something he would never ask for. Inside, his heart was breaking in ways that no sound could capture. He remembered holding this boy as a baby, rocking him to sleep against his chest. He remembered his tiny hands clutching at his shirt the way he once needed him for every breath. Now those same hands, grown and adorned with a gold watch he never earned, gestured to the door like a king dismissing a servant. The father's vision blurred for a moment, not from weakness of age, but from the raw weight of betrayal pushing against his pride. Still he refused to let a tear fall. He drew in a slow breath, careful, steady, though his lungs felt heavy. His eyes lowered to the floorboards he had laid decades ago, each plank nailed with sweat and determination. They creaked beneath his weight now, as if echoing his struggle, as if the house itself felt the crack in his dignity. The sound reminded him of nights he had tiptoed across those same boards, not wanting to wake his son after long shifts. Now every creak was a reminder that his presence here was no longer welcome. The voices of the in-laws floated from the living room, laughter spilling over the rim of their glasses. It sounded distant and cruel, like vultures circling overhead waiting for the body to collapse so they could feast. He tightened his grip on the strap of his worn leather bag, his fingers trembling only slightly. His silence was not weakness, he reminded himself. It was control. It was the only thing left to him, the final piece of dignity they could not strip away unless he handed it to them. His son's eyes flicked toward him again, cold and calculating, as if waiting for him to crumble. The father held the gaze, his own expression unreadable. Behind his stern face, however, a storm raged. Rage collided with grief, pride fought against despair, love wrestled with the bitter poison of betrayal. His insides felt as though they had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, each one cutting deeper with every breath. Yet outside he remained composed, still as stone. The silence stretched on long enough that even the smug smiles began to falter. His son shifted in his stance. His wife glanced away, uncomfortable for the first time. The father's refusal to break unsettled them, though they would never admit it. They wanted spectacle. They wanted him to beg or explode to give them something to feed on. Instead, they were left with a wall they could not climb, a silence that screamed louder than words. He stood straighter, though his chest ached from the weight of his restraint. He told himself he would not let them see the cracks in his heart. They could take the house, they could strip away comfort, but they could not own his spirit unless he allowed it. Still, the cost of that silence gnawed at him. It wasn't peace he carried in that moment. It was poison swallowed whole, festering inside, promising to return in ways no one could yet see. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the room one last time. The photographs, the furniture, the little marks of a family he had tried to hold together, all of it blurred into a haze of color and memory. None of it belonged to him anymore. Not because of law or money, but because of betrayal so sharp it severed the ties that once made this house a home. He breathed in the air thick with the scent of expensive wine, and stale arrogance, and exhaled without a word. The father turned toward the door, every step heavy, but each one fueled by a dignity he refused to abandon. His silence was a mask, but beneath it, his soul was cracking. He could feel himself splintering inside, every memory pressing against the weight of what he had just endured. Still, he kept his back straight, his shoulders squared. He would not leave bowed or broken. The night air met him like a slap, cold and sharp, filling his lungs with something purer than the poisoned air inside. For a moment he stood on the threshold, the house glowing behind him, filled with laughter that once belonged to him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. To look back would mean acknowledging the tears pressing behind his eyes. Instead, he stared forward into the darkness, his silence wrapping around him like armor. He knew he could not stay silent forever. The fire inside him was too strong, the betrayal too deep. This silence was not the end. It was the pause before something greater, the breath before a storm. And though his son believed he had silenced him tonight, the father knew the truth. Silence was only the beginning, and when it broke, it would shake their world to its core. The father stepped into the night with his old suitcase in hand, the weight of it dragging against his arm, heavier than it had ever felt before. The drizzle began almost as soon as the door closed behind him, a cold mist that clung to his coat and seeped through the cracks of his resolve. Each drop stung like a reminder of where he had been, what he had just lost, and the cruel truth that he was no longer wanted in the home he had built with his own blood and sweat. The sound of the rain against the pavement was steady, relentless, matching the dull thud of his heart as he moved down the path alone. The streetlights glowed dim through the mist, stretching his shadow across the wet ground, long and distorted, as though mocking him with an image of a man stretched too thin. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step echoing in the silence. Behind him, faint bursts of laughter leaked through the closed windows of the house, muffled but unmistakable. They were celebrating, still raising their glasses, uncaring that the man who had given them everything was now walking into the darkness with nothing but a battered suitcase and the shards of his dignity. He paused at the edge of the driveway, gripping the handle tighter. The leather was cracked and worn, patched with the marks of decades, much like his hands. That suitcase had traveled with him through the hardest years of his life. It had carried tools when he labored on construction sites, spare clothes when he worked overnight jobs, even toys for his son, when times were lean and every dollar mattered. Now it carried nothing of value, just a few clothes and the echo of a life that had been ripped from him. The mist thickened, settling on his hair and dripping into his eyes. He blinked it away, refusing to let it disguise the sting of humiliation. His chest felt hollow, as though every beat of his heart was an effort, a burden. He looked down the road, the stretch of wet asphalt leading into a blur of shadows and silence. He had no destination, only distance. Distance from the house, from the betrayal, from the smirks that would haunt him long after tonight. His footsteps grew slower, heavier. Each one felt like dragging chains, like carrying not just his suitcase, but the weight of every memory tied to that home. He remembered the nights he carried his sleeping son up the same driveway after long days at work. He remembered rushing home from shifts in the rain, hoping to make it in time for dinner. Now the same driveway spat him out into the world, as if it no longer had room for him. The cold settled deep in his bones, a loneliness sharper than the drizzle. Cars passed occasionally in the distance, their headlights slicing through the mist for a moment before disappearing, leaving him in darkness again. No one slowed, no one looked. To them, he was just another old man on the side of the road, trudging through the rain with a suitcase too heavy for his shoulders. None of them knew he carried a broken heart inside that case, that he was walking away from a betrayal too cruel to name. His throat tightened as he reached the corner, the house shrinking behind him. He resisted the urge to turn back to look one last time at the place where he had given everything. Looking back would mean acknowledging the tears that threatened, and he had promised himself they would not see him cry. He pressed forward, his shoes splashing in shallow puddles, the cold water seeping into his socks. But he did not slow. Every step was a reminder of his solitude. He had no one waiting, no warm light in a window to greet him. The silence of the road stretched out like a punishment, a cruel counterpoint to the noise of the celebration behind him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly cast out, discarded, like something no longer useful. The rain was his only companion, falling steady against his back as though the sky itself pitied him. The ache in his chest deepened with each block. His thoughts spiraled into questions he could not answer. How had it come to this? How had the boy he once shielded from every storm turned into the man who threw him into one? The son he had raised with love, the son he had lifted through life, had chosen money over blood, comfort over loyalty. That choice carved deeper than any wound. The father adjusted the suitcase in his grip, his shoulders straining, his breath visible in the cool night air. He felt smaller with every step, his presence shrinking against the enormity of the betrayal. Yet beneath the sorrow, a whisper began to stir, faint but undeniable. It told him that this walk, this night, was not just an ending. It was the beginning of something else, something neither his son nor those smug faces in the living room could ever anticipate. He pressed forward through the drizzle, the lights of the house fading behind him, the road stretching ahead like a path carved by fate. His silence remained unbroken, but inside the storm gathered. And though he looked every bit the lonely man with no place to go, there was something hidden behind his eyes, a flicker of resolve that the rain could not wash away. What his son had mistaken for defeat was only the shadow of something much greater, something waiting in the darkness just beyond this lonely walk. The drizzle clung to him as he walked farther into the night, soaking the edges of his coat and dripping from his brow, but it was nothing compared to the cold that had settled inside his chest. His suitcase pulled against his arm like a dead weight, every step a reminder that he had no destination, no door to knock on, no bed waiting for him. He thought of his modest pension, the careful savings he had scraped together through decades of labor, and he knew it wouldn't stretch far. Every dollar was measured, every cent accounted for, and none of it had been meant for nights like this, for being cast out like a stray dog in the rain. His stomach knotted with the bitter question of where he would sleep tonight. A shelter. A cheap roadside motel. The thought of lying down on a park bench crossed his mind, and the shame of it made him flinch. He was a father, a provider, a man who had built roofs for others his whole life, and now he wasn't sure if he would have one for himself by morning. The humiliation pressed down harder than the rain. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional hiss of tires through puddles as cars passed by their drivers, oblivious to the figure trudging in the dark. He imagined what they saw if they even noticed an old man clutching a battered suitcase, shoulders hunched, face shadowed by the streetlights. To them he was invisible, a fragment of the city no one wanted to claim. That invisibility cut deep, as though the world had turned its back on him in unison with his own son. He passed rows of houses with glowing windows, each one a glimpse into a world that wasn't his anymore. Families gathered around dinner tables, laughter muffled by the walls, children chasing one another down hallways. Warmth radiated from those windows, but it only deepened his loneliness. He had once provided that same warmth, once filled a house with light and safety. Now he wandered the streets in exile in a world where love and loyalty had an expiration date. His mind churned with despair, spinning in circles that had no end. He wondered how he had misjudged everything so completely. He had believed that years of sacrifice guaranteed some form of love in return, some measure of respect. But respect had been bought and sold tonight with a lottery ticket. He felt foolish, gutted, as though the foundation of his life had been exposed as nothing but sand. The drizzle turned heavier, pressing his hair flat, soaking through his shoes. The chill bit at his bones, but the ache of uncertainty gnawed deeper. His chest tightened with the fear of tomorrow. Would he wake up in a damp, nameless room with nothing but silence for company? Would he even wake up at all if his body gave out in the cold? For the first time, the fragility of his age weighed on him. He was not young anymore, not strong enough to shrug off a night spent shivering on concrete. A neon sign flickered ahead, the kind that buzzes faintly in the night. A motel, worn down and peeling, sat on the corner of the street. He stopped for a moment, staring at it, torn between relief and dread. Relief that there was at least a place he could lie down. Dread that it would cost more than he should spend, that every dollar handed over was another piece of his dwindling future chipped away. His hands trembled as he dug into his coat pocket, feeling the thin stack of bills folded carefully. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough for the life he had left behind. He swallowed hard and stepped forward, his shoes splashing through the puddles as though each one tried to drag him down. His reflection wavered in the water, an old man hunched by betrayal, carrying the look of someone who had lost not just his home, but the sense of belonging that had defined him. He turned his gaze away, ashamed even to see himself. As he reached the door of the motel, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He remembered the warmth of his old bed, the steady tick of the clock in his living room, the scent of wood polish in the hall. Those things had been constant anchors that reminded him who he was. Now they were stripped away, and all that remained was this cheap, neon damp air and the hollow question of how a father could be discarded so easily. His chest tightened again, this time not with pride, but with raw fear. He was walking into an uncertain night with no one to call, no one to lean on. The thought made him dizzy, his breath catching in his throat. He had carried the weight of the world for so long, but tonight it pressed down heavier than ever. He pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges loud in the silence, and stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes. The man behind the counter didn't look up from his magazine as he slid a key across the scratched surface. The indifference was almost a kindness. At least he wasn't judged, at least he wasn't seen. He took the key with trembling fingers and climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath him. Inside the room, the wallpaper peeled at the edges, the bedspread stained with the ghosts of strangers. He set his suitcase on the floor, the thud echoing in the emptiness. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, the springs whining under his weight. For a moment he sat in silence, staring at the dim light flickering above him. His shoulders sagged, his face hollowed by exhaustion and grief. The room was small, suffocating, but it was all he had left. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands trembling between them. The silence pressed in louder than any storm outside. He had never felt so alone, so abandoned, so stripped of everything he thought he could rely on. The despair was raw, heavy, unrelenting. Yet beneath it, buried deep in the rubble of his spirit, a spark remained. He didn't know it yet, but despair has a way of sharpening men, of forging something harder in the fire of loss. And though tonight he sat in darkness, tomorrow would bring a shift neither he nor his son could have imagined. The room felt like a coffin, the stale air pressing down on him, until even his breaths came shallow and uneven. He sat hunched on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, the dim lamp above flickering, as if mocking his despair. His suitcase rested by the door, unopened, a mute witness to the collapse of a life he once believed unshakable. He had sunk so deep into hopelessness that the silence of the room became unbearable. Then, just as his head dropped into his hands, the shrill ring of the phone shattered the air. He startled, his pulse jumping. For a moment, he stared at the old rotary phone on the nightstand, half convinced it was a trick of his imagination. No one called him anymore. His son had severed every tie, and the few friends left had long stopped checking in. Still the phone rang again, its metallic chime slicing through the gloom. His hand trembled as he lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, but carried a weight that gripped him immediately. It was a lawyer, a name he barely recognized, but tied to his late brother's estate, something he had all but forgotten. The man spoke quickly, his words precise, but every syllable carved into the father's despair like a lifeline. Papers had been finalized, and after years of wading through courts and disputes, his share had been released. A property, not just a house, but land. Valuable land sitting on the edge of a growing city, and it was his, clear, uncontested, undeniable. He blinked, his chest tightening, the shift from despair to shock so sudden it felt like the room tilted around him. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles pale. The lawyer continued explaining details, rattling off figures that seemed unreal. Numbers he had never dared to imagine. He barely heard the specifics. His mind was a storm caught between disbelief and the flicker of something he hadn't felt in hours. Hope. 20 minutes. That's all it took. 20 minutes for his world to swing from the pit of loneliness to the edge of something entirely different. The despair that had pressed against him only moments before cracked apart, letting in a sliver of light so bright it almost blinded him. He could hardly speak when the call ended. His throat was tight, his mind reeling, but his heart hammered with a new rhythm. He set the receiver down slowly, staring at it as if it might ring again to confirm it was real. His hands shook, but not from weakness this time. It was the tremor of anticipation of possibilities rushing in where hopelessness had lived. He stood pacing the small room, the worn carpet muffling his steps. The walls that had felt like a prison now seemed temporary, a cage he was already unlocking. His son's smirk flashed in his mind, the cruel dismissal, the arrogance of wealth that had never been earned. The memory still burned, but now it burned differently. Not as pain, but as fuel. His son thought the lottery was power thought. Money could sever blood, erase love, rewrite history. But he didn't know what had just happened. He didn't know that the father he cast out had just been handed the kind of leverage that couldn't be bought with a winning ticket. The father moved to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. The rain had slowed the drizzle, tapering into mist. The street outside glistened under the dull glow of neon, each drop on the asphalt shining like fragments of stars. He saw his reflection faintly in the glass, an old man with hollow eyes and deep lines carved by years of sacrifice. But behind the weariness, something new glimmered, a spark small but fierce, refusing to be snuffed out. He pressed his hand against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He whispered to himself, not out of weakness, but out of certainty, the words forming with steel in his voice. This isn't over. The motel room, the rain, the despair, it was all temporary. His life had not ended in betrayal. It had been reborn in fire. He turned back to the suitcase, the same old case that had felt like a symbol of exile only an hour ago. Now it was different. It wasn't a weight dragging him down. It was a vessel for his next move, for the choices that lay ahead. He crouched, flipping the latches open, and for the first time that night he unpacked, not with sorrow but with intent. Every shirt folded, every item placed carefully, was no longer a remnant of what had been lost. They were tools for what was coming. The father sat back on the bed, the key to his future rattling in his mind like thunder. 20 minutes had rewritten the ending his son thought he controlled. 20 minutes had armed him with something far more dangerous than silence. The despair was gone, replaced by anticipation, by strategy, by the cold, quiet promise of retribution. And as the night deepened, the rain finally stopped. The silence no longer suffocated him. It waited like a stage about to be lit. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the thought settle in his bones. Tomorrow would not be another day of defeat. Tomorrow the game would begin. The father lay awake in the dim motel room, the hum of the neon sign outside flickering against the wall like a pulse. The lawyer's call still echoed in his ears, every detail replaying with sharp clarity. His despair had been deep enough to drown him only an hour before, but now the tide had shifted. He stared at the cracked ceiling. His hands folded across his chest, and he felt something stirring inside that he thought had been buried long ago. It wasn't rage, not anymore. It wasn't grief. It was clarity, clean and cold, like the snap of ice breaking on a river. His son might have millions, but money was only one card in the game. And the father knew games. He had been playing them his whole life, not at poker tables or lottery lines, but in the grit of survival, in the unrelenting world of hard labor and hard lessons. He had learned how to bend when the wind blew, how to endure storms that would crush weaker men, and how to strike only when the timing was perfect. That kind of wisdom wasn't bought, it was forged, and it was still in his blood. He sat up slowly, his silhouette framed by the thin light bleeding through the curtains. The old suitcase rested at his feet, no longer a symbol of exile but of preparation. His mind moved with precision, now measuring the steps ahead. His son thought the eviction was the end, thought the lottery had crowned him king. But kings could be toppled and thrones could be taken back. The father understood this better than anyone, because he had built thrones with his bare hands for others, watching them crumble when arrogance grew faster than their foundations. His chest tightened, but not with sorrow. It was something fiercer. Determination burned through the hollow spaces grief had left behind. He remembered nights under floodlights at job sites, his muscles screaming as he pushed through fatigue, his hands cut raw but never pausing. He remembered repairing roofs through winter storms so other families would stay warm. He remembered walking into banks with nothing but resolve and leaving with loans he knew he'd repay because failure wasn't an option. That was the blood in his veins, not the weakness his son had mistaken for age, not the silence mistaken for surrender. He had survived worse. And he was not done yet. The motel air smelled stale, but when he breathed in, he felt something sharper, like the scent of steel before a blade is drawn. He rose to his feet, the springs of the bed groaning behind him. His reflection in the warped mirror across the room caught his attention. He studied the man staring back at him. The wrinkles carved into his skin weren't marks of defeat. They were records of endurance. His eyes, though tired, still carried the fire of someone who had never truly given up. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see a victim. He saw a fighter. He thought of his son's smug grin, the arrogance of wealth that had never been earned. That image no longer crushed him. It fueled him. He almost smiled, not with joy, but with the grim certainty of a man who knows what's coming. His son believed the lottery had changed everything. He had no idea that what it had truly done was awaken something that had slept inside his father for years. The father opened the suitcase, pulling out the few belongings he had carried. He laid them neatly on the bed as though organizing the fragments of his life into order. Each piece felt deliberate now, part of a ritual. He wasn't a man lost anymore. He was a man calculating, preparing, moving toward something larger than his son could imagine. He moved to the window and looked out over the dark street. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick, the reflections of neon glowing like veins of fire. He placed his hand against the glass, the cool surface steadying him, and whispered softly, almost as if to himself, "You think you've won." His breath fogged against the pane, blurring the view outside, but his eyes remained clear. This was no longer about pain. It was about resolve. The father could feel it coursing through him, his heartbeat steady, his mind sharp. He had been blindsided, humiliated, cast aside, but all of that had been a spark striking steel. Now the fire had caught, and it burned with purpose. He would not move blindly. He would wait, plan, and strike when the moment was right. Because that was the lesson a lifetime of endurance had taught him. Revenge wasn't loud. It was patient. He returned to the bed, lowering himself slowly, the weight of his body sinking into the thin mattress. But he didn't lie down. He sat tall, his back against the wall. His gaze locked on the door as though expecting it to open. His body might have been weary, but his spirit had never felt more alive. The despair that had chained him only hours ago had transformed into something sharper, something unstoppable. He thought of his wife gone too soon and the promises he had whispered over her grave, that he would protect their son, that he would see him grow into a man worth the sacrifices. That promise had shattered tonight, but in its place another had formed, harder and colder. He would not allow his legacy to end in betrayal. He would not let his name be erased by greed. His hand closed around the phone again, not to call, not yet, but to feel the weight of connection to the world that had just shifted under his feet. He tapped his fingers against it slowly, rhythmically, like a drumbeat of certainty. The cards were being dealt, and his son had no idea the game had just begun. The father's eyes narrowed as he leaned back, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the shadow of one. He had been broken, yes. But broken things, when reforged, were often stronger than before. And as the night deepened around him, he knew one truth beyond doubt: the fire had returned, and it would not be extinguished. Tomorrow his son would still bask in the glow of wealth, still laugh with arrogance, still believe he held all the power. But the father would wake not as a man defeated, he would wake as a man reborn. And what awaited his son was not the silence of surrender, but the storm of reckoning. The father sat in the silence of the motel room, the hum of the neon outside fading into the background, his breath steady, his heart no longer stumbling beneath the weight of despair. The storm inside him had shifted. Pain had forged itself into steel. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let the promise take shape, not spoken aloud, not written on paper, but etched into the marrow of his bones. His son believed betrayal was the end of the story, but he was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, a reckoning that would arrive in silence, colder than the night, sharper than any blade. He remembered the look on his son's face, that grin of arrogant triumph, the smugness of a man who believed money erased debt, erased loyalty, erased blood itself. That grin had burned into his memory, seared into him until it was no longer a wound but a weapon. He whispered to himself, almost without sound, words that carried the weight of stone. "You'll learn." It wasn't anger that gave them power. It was certainty. The son had won the lottery, yes, but what he hadn't won, and what he never could, was the unbreakable resilience of the man he had cast aside. The father's silence was no longer the silence of humiliation. It was strategy. Every quiet breath, every controlled movement, every withheld tear was a brick in the wall he was building, a fortress of patience, a shield of dignity. He knew that revenge delivered in noise could be ignored, dismissed as bitterness. But revenge crafted in silence, in precision, carried weight. It struck without warning, without mercy, and it left scars that money could never heal. He rose from the bed, his frame casting a long shadow against the wall. The mirror on the far side of the room reflected him back, not as a defeated man, but as a figure carved in resolve. His face was weathered, yes, but his eyes burned with a cold fire, the fire of a man who had been underestimated for too long. He placed his hand on the suitcase, feeling the rough leather under his palm, and it no longer felt like baggage. It felt like a vessel of intent, a reminder that he still had tools left to wield weapons that required no steel or gunpowder, only time, patience, and will. His son thought he had stripped him of everything. But the father knew better. Money could buy a house, but it couldn't buy the hands that built it. Money could buy influence, but it couldn't buy wisdom earned through decades of sacrifice. Money could buy company, but it could never buy loyalty or love. And it was those things, his endurance, his cunning, his unshakable pride, that would one day turn the tables. He paced the room slowly, his footsteps soundless against the worn carpet. In his mind, he began to trace the outlines of the future. He saw his son basking in the glow of wealth, blind to the cracks forming beneath him. He saw the smug in-laws clinking glasses, never realizing the ground was shifting. And he saw himself waiting in the shadows, gathering strength, preparing the moment when silence would break and justice would arrive. Every betrayal carried within it the seed of downfall. His son had planted his own. The father didn't need to rage or curse. He only needed to watch, to plan to strike when the moment was ripe. That was the essence of silent revenge. It did not announce itself. It did not scream. It arrived like frost in the night, quiet and merciless, and when morning came, nothing was the same. He stood at the window again, the street below, glistening with the last remnants of rain. His reflection stared back, blurred by the glass, and for the first time that night he allowed himself a smile. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, curved at the corner of his mouth. Not joy, not relief. It was the smile of a man who had decided his course, a man who had been broken and rebuilt stronger. The betrayal would not be forgotten. It would be repaid, not with fury, not with noise, but with something colder, cleaner. Justice delivered in silence. His son would wake each day believing he had secured his victory, blind to the truth, moving quietly beneath the surface. And when the truth finally emerged, when the reckoning unfolded, he would understand what his arrogance had cost him. The father pressed his hand against the glass, the coolness grounding him, sealing the vow he had made. He would carry it in his silence, nurture it in patience, and sharpen it with every memory of sacrifice turned to dust. He would not chase vengeance recklessly. He would sculpt it carefully piece by piece until the day it was ready. Outside, the night deepened the city, quieting into stillness. He let it settle around him, a cloak of calm, a promise that silence itself could be the most powerful weapon. And as he stepped back from the window, the vow burned brighter in his chest. His son thought he had won, but the father knew the truth. The real game had just begun, and in the end, it would not be the lottery winner who held the final hand. It would be the man he had cast out, returning in silence with justice that could not be bought. The room fell still, the neon light pulsing faintly against the wall. The father sat once more, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon only he could see. The pain was gone, replaced by purpose. The despair had been buried, replaced by fire. And the vow he carried now was no longer a whisper of survival. It was the cold, certain promise of silent revenge. Life often reminds us that wealth, status, or even family ties can shift in unexpected ways. But what remains unshaken is the strength of character we carry within ourselves. This story is not just about betrayal, it is about resilience. A father cast aside learned that dignity cannot be taken by force, and that silence, when filled with wisdom and patience, can be the sharpest form of justice. For older generations, it is a reminder that our sacrifices are not erased by the ingratitude of others. The years of labor, the lessons of endurance, and the courage to rise again, these are treasures no amount of money can buy. Life may bring moments of abandonment or disappointment, but within those moments lies the chance to rediscover our own worth, to protect our dignity, and to remind the world that respect must be earned, not purchased. If you've ever faced trials that made you question your value, remember your strength and wisdom are your greatest inheritance. Hold on to that truth and never let betrayal define you. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may inspire others who need to hear it.